Russian President Vladimir Putin just addressed the Russian people as tensions escalate in the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And we want to get to that breaking news. The Russian president telling the Russian people that he intends to recognize two separatist areas in eastern Ukraine as independent. And joining me now to talk about the consequences of that, White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks, ABC News' Elizabeth Schelsey from Washington, former Trump administration Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy. So, Mary Alice, I want to start with you. We know that Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky also tweeted about a conversation that he had with President Biden while this whole announcement is coming about. So, what do we know about this call and the current conversations going on between these leaders?
Yeah, Diane, the White House has been telling us the last few days that President Biden has been in near constant contact with his counterpart, President Zelensky, in Ukraine. You saw there the tweet, the confirmation from President Zelensky that he spoke with Biden. The president has spent most of today huddled behind closed doors with no public events, instead meeting with senior members of his national security team, including the vice president, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. Clearly, the president trying to stay up to date. The big question now is, how is the West going to respond? Just a few days ago, we saw the Secretary of State say that a move like this from President Putin would be, quote, a gross violation of international law and necessitate a swift and firm response. So I imagine that behind closed doors, President Biden is trying to decide and work with allies and partners on a response, on a unified response. The National Security Team has been telling us they are very aware that sanctions will only change Putin's calculus if they are done together as one bloc and one unified voice.
Ian, I want to go to Ian Panel, who's there in the Ukraine. Ian, what does this announcement mean for the Ukrainian people?
Coming to pass, I think we've just entered the most dangerous point in this crisis. I think the question is, what we've seen is that they've essentially, that Vladimir Putin has said that he recognises the independence of these two small statelets. That isn't really the question tonight. The question is, what does that lead to? Of course, the West will have to decide what the consequences are for Vladimir Putin in terms of sanctions. But I think it's fanciful to imagine that it stops just there, that is all of Vladimir Putin's ambitions. If you listen to this long, rambling revisionism of history, he essentially said that Ukraine was a construct to the Soviet Union, that it was Russia who essentially created Ukraine. He undermined Ukraine's justification for its very existence, and therefore it kind of indicates that this isn't where it ends. You'll only need the leaders of these breakaway republics to then ask Vladimir Putin for assistance against the Ukrainians who are attacking in their eyes. There's no evidence to support that, but that's a narrative that they've been portraying, to then see these weapons start to roll across the border. In the words of one person on Twitter tonight, you don't need 190,000 troops around the borders to declare these breakaway areas as independent. They're there for another purpose. Now, we're not on that territory yet, but that is the clear danger.
And Ian, we heard him say things like that Ukraine is a puppet for the United States. He threatened military action and told the Ukraine government to cease all military action or face full responsibility in those separatist areas. He's used words like genocide, implying there's a genocide of Russian people in those areas. How much is misinformation playing to all of this, and what are you seeing on the ground in terms of violence? I'm not sure if Ian can hear me now. We'll try to get him back. But Mary Alice, it's a little mind-boggling because we started the day with this sliver of hope for diplomacy, right? The White House signaling that President Biden was willing, at least in theory, to meet with President Putin as long as he didn't invade Ukraine. Where does that stand now?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine any summit like that going forward. And overnight, our White House sources were incredibly skeptical about the possibility of a summit. They told us that there was still overwhelming evidence that Putin planned to invade. And, listening to Putin speak, I was reminded how day after day, week after week, we've been asking the White House if it was possible that all of these negotiations, all of this diplomatic effort could be used by Russia as a pretext, as sort of a ruse, that would it be possible that Putin was just playing the West West and pretending to come to the negotiating table when they had already decided to invade, already put plans in place for extreme military action. And frankly, the White House said it was incredibly possible. It was completely possible. But we heard the Secretary of State, we heard the National Security Advisor say, nonetheless, they felt obligated to try. But listening to President Putin speak there, to talk so holistically about how he viewed the Russian Empire, to so dismiss the idea of Ukraine as an independent and sovereign nation that has been for years, I was struck by that idea that maybe Putin never intended to come to the negotiating table.
And it sounds like we have Ian back. Ian, I want to go back to the question that I tried to ask you before, which is this reference to Ukraine being a puppet for the U.S. and this threat for the Ukrainian government to cease military operations in those separatist areas to stop the Russian genocide, as Vladimir Putin calls it, in those areas. How much is misinformation playing into all of this, and what is the real picture of the violence on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, this is the alternate universe in which the propaganda is being constructed. I mean, I couldn't agree with Mary Alice more. This is a much larger ambition that's been stated by Vladimir Putin here. This is about the restoration of Russian power, and it undermines any attempts at some kind of diplomatic resolution to this. It looks like Russia, looks like Putin certainly wasn't interested in that. And if you look at the narrative that's being portrayed, to the Russian public, it's that the Ukrainian military is on the offensive. I mean, we even saw the Russian military today talk about 2 Russian armored personnel carriers that had crossed over into Russian territory that were taken out by Russian military forces. I mean, this is all fanciful. The attacks that have been cited over the last few days, these so-called false flags, in other words, manufactured crises to try and justify the intervention of Russia, has been almost childish if it weren't so serious, the way it's being conducted. But Russian state TV, pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin media is portraying this as the Ukrainians attacking the Russian-speaking minority there. We've seen Vladimir Putin and other senior members of the Russian cabinet use this offensive term of a genocide to refer to the treatment of the Russian-speaking population there without any evidence whatsoever. That's why they've encouraged people to evacuate from those territories, the women, the children, the elderly, because they're under attack. They're housing them in refugee tents across Russia. This has been totally manufactured by the Kremlin, by these breakaway republics, to try and justify what we're now seeing. And it's exactly what the Biden administration has been saying all along would happen. And of course, they had to issue those warnings. And the longer those warnings went on without things coming to pass, people started to raise questions about how valid those warnings were. Well, we now know the answer. Those warnings were absolutely on the money. And what we're seeing now unfold is exactly what we were warned would happen. And the real fear is that what we're seeing now is not the end game. This is just the start.
Well, so I want to take that point and go to Elizabeth Schulze then with that, because Elizabeth, as Ian points out, the State Department, our U.S. government told us that this would happen. And we heard the State Department say that this would be a gross violation of international law if it did happen. So now what?
Well, Diane, there's no doubt that the U.S. and its allies see this as an escalation, and now it's really on them to say, how are they going to respond to this escalation? We are already getting some reaction from allies, including UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who said this is very plainly a breach in international law. It's a sentiment that's also being echoed by the European Commissioner. So likely they are going to have to follow through now in saying, we have said that this is a threat. What are we going to do in response? Sanctions are the obvious choice here. The question is really how big of a sanctions they impose, as we've been talking about. Is it this full package that's being negotiated between the U.S. and its NATO and European allies, or is it a smaller part of that so that they leave other options on the table? And really part of that depends on whether this is the first of President Putin's moves or just the beginning of a bigger all-out attack, as Ian has pointed out.
And Elizabeth Newman, in your many years at DHS, you've had kind of been in the background of making some of these decisions for previous administrations. So what do you think? What is the right and likely response from NATO at this point?
Well, the most important thing is unity. We have seen NATO and the West unify in ways that we haven't seen them really since 9/11. So maintaining that unity is of the utmost importance, because that is the one thing that I think Putin didn't fully expect. I think he expected alliances to fracture, that there would be disagreement, and by maintaining that unity, it makes it harder for him to continue with his plans. Now, I still think he's going to invade, as Ian has suggested. There's just no reason that you put 190,000 troops, 75% of your forces on 3 sides of the country only for this small little territorial annex, if you will. So I do think that he will proceed, but it is incredibly important for the U.S. to maintain unity with all of our Western allies, and whatever the decision is in terms of sanctions at this point, it needs to be a unified decision.
And so, Mick, that's the kind of financial response and diplomatic response. What do you think the military response is going to be to all of this?
Well, Diane, I would definitely agree with Alyssa's point that we need to be unified. So both economic sanctions, and I would hope that some would be levied now, maybe not the most severe, but some. And to your question on military responses, I think we need to continue to look at what we need to ensure that NATO is completely bolstered and the defensive positions are in place. So if we need to send more forces to Eastern Europe, then I think we should look at doing that. I also think that as President Putin drags us on, we should increase the pressure and increase the negatives toward him. So if we are going to deliver more weapons and equipment to the Ukrainian army, we need to do it now. We need to publicly put that out there, and we need to prepare to send more, quite frankly, because we need to ensure that President Putin takes into his calculus that everything he's doing is exaggerating the very concerns that he claimed to be worried about. And we need to ensure that we increase those negatives toward him as he goes forward.
All right. Many thanks to you all for the analysis. We appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.